We are now joined via Zoom by economist Owen Khumalo to weigh in on the rising cost of living in South Africa. Owen, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for joining us. I mean, there are strong indications, that South Africa's economy is now back to pre-pandemic levels. Take us through what the outlook is currently. I mean, is South Africa on the recovering path following the pandemic?
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I would say, yes, the South African economy is on the recovery path. And as you mentioned now, the size of the economy is back to pre-pandemic levels. In the last two quarters, we have had positive GDP growth. So fourth quarter of 2021, the economy grew by 1.4%. And the first quarter of 2022, the economy grew by 1.9%. But if you look at what has happened in the pandemic period and also even pre-pandemic, and I look back at the last 18 quarters of GDP growth going back to the first quarter of 2019, out of those 18 quarters, we have had 8 quarters of positive GDP growth. Only 3 quarters were negative, and 2 quarters the GDP growth was flat. Now, interestingly as well, of the 8 quarters of positive GDP growth in the last 13 quarters, 6 of them came after the second quarter of 2020 at the height of the COVID lockdowns. Long answer to your question, yes, the South African economy is actually on a recovery path from the effects of the global pandemic of COVID-19.
Before I can, ask you about what we are likely to expect, in this second half of the year, I want us to talk about the effects that this current situation is having on consumers in as far as rising food and fuel prices is concerned. I mean, Eskom's load shedding also not helping businesses, particularly small businesses, now having to realize that they've survived COVID, but they may have to shut down because of what is happening at the utility. Talk to us about the impact on a macroeconomic level that this is having for ordinary South Africans particularly.
Yeah, as ordinary South Africans, we're having to bear the brunt of what's happening, not just here in South Africa, as you point out with the load shedding, but what's happening globally. So the biggest global economic challenge at the moment is rising inflation, and it's across the world. Whether you're looking at the emerging markets like ourselves, you're looking at Europe, you're looking at the US, we're looking at record inflation numbers. So what's driving the high inflation numbers? So three big things. The first is oil, if we look back even pre-COVID or pre the war in Ukraine by Russia, we were seeing a recovery coming out of the COVID crisis. At the height of COVID and the lockdowns, we had very little demand in terms of energy because most economies were shut down, so the global economic engine wasn't running on at all. So oil prices tumbled. You remember, we went down as far as less than $20 per barrel of Brent crude oil. And then as the global economy started opening up and production and manufacturing ramped up, we saw oil prices rising. Then on top of that, then we saw Russia invading Ukraine. And we know that Russia is a very significant global player in the production and supply of oil to world markets. So what's driving oil prices further beyond the recovery of the global economy post-COVID is now fear, not necessarily high demand. It's fear of supply bottlenecks and shortage of supply caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The second contributor to high inflation is food prices. And we know that both Russia and Ukraine are big grain producers that supply some parts of Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and particularly Africa, especially North Africa, with important grains. And this is now adding to the supply chain bottlenecks we saw coming out of the COVID crisis, that Ukraine cannot move their grains to supply these important world markets. So that has pushed food prices up. And then the third factor, as I said, is supply chain bottlenecks, which were severely impacted by COVID-19. and the lockdowns, and now the war in Ukraine is contributing to that. So unfortunately, until we see a resolution to the war in Ukraine, oil prices are likely to remain high, food prices are likely to remain high, and inflation numbers are then likely to remain at current levels or even go up even further.
My question was going to then be, what are we likely to expect in the second half of 2022? But I think at the top of the challenges in this country is that Ukraine and Russia war that you mentioned. But to what extent does, the lack of, consumer trust have to do with some of our, our challenges locally here in South Africa, and also in as far as weak business is concerned?
Yeah, we've got, despite all these global challenges that are affecting everyone else around the globe, and we're not spared from them, we've got our own domestic challenges. Yeah. Consumer confidence is very low at the moment. We're actually hitting historic lows in terms of consumer confidence, and add to that the pressure we're getting from rising food prices, but also the lockdown. So the load shedding rather. So load shedding is affecting not just households, but it's affecting companies and especially the manufacturing sector, so productivity is down. So yeah, it's a cocktail of challenges that we're facing at the moment. That until we resolve those, we're unlikely to see a very good second half in terms of GDP growth in South Africa. The first quarter growth came driven mainly from manufacturing, trade, and finance. But that first quarter didn't have a lot of the load shedding we're experiencing now. So we're alternating between stage 4 and stage 6. And that has got a severe impact on GDP growth going forward. So we're desperate to see a resolution to the load shedding challenge. And that will help us in the second half of this year to lift those GDP numbers. Even the positive picture I'm painting now of positive GDP growth in the last 2 quarters and as I said, majority of the last 18 quarters have been positive. Still not enough to address the challenges we face as an economy.
And yet, you find that government remains committed, to its key policy reforms, and of course also, wanting to see some form of a reduction in your bottlenecks as it comes to infrastructure, etc. I mean, how likely is that, given what we are looking at and what we are faced with from a global perspective, and how that's impacting our local economy?
Yeah, well, commitment is one thing, and implementation is another. So we as a country, we're very good on coming up with grand plans and commitments, but when it comes to implementation, we fall short. But nonetheless, there have been some positive movements. One of the key economic reforms that the economy has been in need of and looking forward to is the auctioning of spectrum, because that affects the ease of doing business in terms of how we communicate and how we transact and how we send bulk data across platforms, digital platforms. And there was a positive move there recently in terms of the auctioning of spectrum, which the industry and the economy has been waiting for. But I'm a bit concerned now because there's a recent High Court ruling where that is being challenged. So we'll wait and see. But from government's point of view, in terms of policy commitment, we've seen the commitment. We just need to see the implementation coming through in terms of some key reforms, like the reform of the SOEs, reform around the public sector wage bill, and others. So yes, yeah, we have no choice but to implement those key economic reforms.
Owen Khumalo, thank you so much for your perspective. Really do appreciate your time on the show.